Welcome to the deep dive. We're continuing our Talking Ketamine series, and this is episode 16. You might be listening because you're one of the many people thinking about or maybe even already getting ketamine treatments, things like IV infusions or ketamine-assisted therapy for depression. It's a topic that's really, well, it's taken off, hasn't it? And you can see why, given some of the potential benefits people are talking about.
Absolutely. And, as more people explore these options, it's just so important to get the whole picture, not just the promising side, but also potential side effects that maybe aren't discussed as much. We know about temporary things like maybe feeling a bit disoriented or nauseous, sure. But there's an area that doesn't always come up, but it's really relevant. And that's how ketamine might affect sexual health. So yeah, this deep dive is really zeroing in on that specific question.
Okay, and to help us, you brought a key source. It's a systematic review from 2023. So this isn't just one study, it's like a big overview, right? Pulling together what different studies have found specifically about ketamine use and sexual dysfunction. Our mission today, then, is to sort of unpack what this review tells us, see what the science, limited as it might be, suggests, and what that could mean for you if you're looking into medical ketamine. All right, let's unpack this.
Okay, so yeah, think of a systematic review like this. Researchers go out and gather all the studies they can find on a really specific topic. They have strict rules for which studies count. Then they summarize what all that combined evidence seems to show. In this case, they were looking for studies connecting ketamine use, or that bladder condition, ketamine cystitis, with sexual function.
Right, and after doing that big search, looking everywhere, how many studies actually, made the cut, met their criteria?
This is actually pretty striking. They only found 4.
Yeah.
Just 4 studies that were specific enough and rigorous enough to include.
4.
Yeah. And that tells us something right off the bat. Compared to other research areas, there's just not a lot out there specifically on ketamine and sexual health. We're working with, well, limited data.
Okay, only 4. That's, yeah, fewer than I'd have guessed with all the buzz around ketamine. All right, let's dive into those 4 then. The review seems to start with findings about men. 2 main studies there.
That's right. The first one they discuss is by Yang and colleagues. This study looked at over 1,000 men in Taiwan who were using ketamine. But it's really important who these men were. Some were individuals picked up by the police for illicit drug use. Others were men showing up at urology clinics, likely because they already had health problems.
Ah, okay. So definitely not people getting, say, IV ketamine for depression in a clinic. Understood. What did they find in this group?
Well, using a standard questionnaire, they found 30.8% reported experiencing erectile dysfunction, ED.
Almost a third.
Yeah. And the ED was more common and tended to be more severe in the guys who were already seeking help at the urology clinics. Makes sense, maybe. But here's what's really interesting. The risk factors. Being over 30 was one. And crucially, a longer duration of using ketamine. That was significantly linked to ED.
Longer duration. What about how much they used, like the dose?
Interestingly, in this study, the average daily dose, or even how they were using it, wasn't linked to ED. It was the duration that stood out.
Huh. Okay, wait. Duration matters, but dose didn't in that study. That feels a bit backwards, doesn't it? Usually you think higher dose, bigger effect. Any idea why duration might be the key factor here?
That's a really sharp question. The review itself doesn't spell out a definitive why. But, one possibility, just thinking about it, maybe the body or brain mechanism involved needs a certain cumulative exposure over time. So it's not just about one big dose, but the total time spent using it that leads to these more persistent changes like ED. Or perhaps dose relates more to acute effects, while duration relates to chronic ones. It's just a correlation they found, remember, not proof of cause. But it's a strong signal from this data.
Right.
And they do mention limitations. It's self-reported questionnaires.
Yeah.
And the setting, being questioned by police.
Right.
That could affect answers.
Absolutely. Context is crucial. Okay, what about the second study on men? Supia and colleagues.
Right. This one's a bit smaller, over 100 men recruited in Malaysia. And they used a simpler approach. Just ask the straight yes or no question. Have you experienced ED in the last year?
Simpler question. And the result, higher or lower?
Even higher. 52% said yes, they had experienced ED.
Wow, over half.
Yeah. And guess what they found was associated with higher odds of reporting ED?
Let me guess. Duration.
Bingo. Longer duration of ketamine use.
Oh.
Again. And this link held up whether the guys were using only ketamine or using other drugs too.
Okay, so let's recap the male findings. 2 studies, different places, different groups, one involving police and clinics, one recruited, different methods, a detailed questionnaire versus a simple yes/no, different percentages, 30% versus 50%, but both seem to point towards a potential link between ketamine use and ED. And in both cases, the duration of use gets flagged. That consistency, that's notable, isn't it?
It really is. Even with the different numbers, that signal about duration popping up in both studies, despite the differences, strengthens the idea that there might be something there. It suggests that, at least in these groups of often heavy, longer-term users, how long someone uses ketamine could be a really important factor in their risk for ED. We don't know why yet, but the correlation is there in these studies.
Okay, so that covers what the review found regarding men. What about women? Is there similar research or less?
Definitely less, according to this review. They highlighted one main study relevant to women. It's by Zhang and colleagues from back in 2011. But this study looks specifically at women who had developed ketamine cystitis, KC. That's that severe bladder condition.
Right. The one linked to chronic ketamine use causes pain, needing to go all the time, urgency.
Yeah.
Sounds awful.
Exactly. So this study compared 56 women who had KC with a control group of women who didn't. They used a standard tool called the Female Sexual Function Index, the FSFI. It asks about lots of different aspects: desire, arousal, lubrication, orgasm, satisfaction, pain.
Okay, and how did the women with ketamine cystitis score on that index?
Significantly lower across the board, almost.
Sure.
Lower scores for arousal, lubrication, orgasm, overall satisfaction. And importantly, they reported significantly more pain during sexual activity.
More pain. Makes sense if they have severe bladder inflammation.
Exactly. But interestingly, their scores for sexual desire were not significantly different from the control group.
Oh, okay. So the desire was still there, potentially, but the physical experience, arousal, orgasm, comfort was significantly impacted, possibly because of the pain from the KC itself.
That seemed like a very plausible connection, yes. The review suggests that the pelvic pain from the KC is likely a major factor driving those lower function scores, especially the pain during sex. But again, limitations are key here. This study only looked at women with severe KC, a specific complication from often heavy, prolonged use. It wasn't looking at women using ketamine more generally.
Right.
And they didn't report the specific doses or durations for these women, plus the sample size was pretty small.
So we've got potential physical impacts, ED in men, and broader sexual function issues in women, particularly seeming linked to pain from KC. But you mentioned 4 studies. Does the review touch on maybe the brain, like a neurological component?
Yes. The 4th study included the review, tried to look at that. It's by Lau and colleagues from 2018. This one used brain imaging, fMRI. They had a few groups: chronic ketamine users who also smoked, people who smoked but didn't use ketamine, and healthy non-smokers.
Okay, brain scans. What did they do?
They showed the participants sexual cues, pictures, maybe videos while they were in the fMRI scanner. They wanted to see which parts of the brain lit up or didn't in response.
And for the chronic ketamine users, what did their brain activity look like?
Compared to the other groups, the chronic ketamine users showed less brain activation in a couple of specific areas when they saw the sexual cues, specifically the left cerebellum and the middle temporal cortex. These are areas involved in, well, lots of things, but including processing sensory input and maybe playing a role in reward or pleasure pathways. It's complex.
Less activation in response to sexual cues in areas linked to sensation or pleasure. What could that mean?
The researchers propose that this hypoactivation, this lower activation, might be part of the neural story behind reduced sexual pleasure or function. It hints that chronic ketamine use might affect not just the body, but also how the brain responds to sexual stimuli, maybe contributing to difficulty experiencing pleasure. Even if, like in the women's study, the basic desire is still there, it adds another potential dimension.
Okay, so putting these 4 studies together, 2 surveys on men, mostly illicit users, linking duration to ED, 1 study on women with KC linking pain and dysfunction, and 1 brain scan study suggesting altered responses to sexual cues in chronic users. The review itself says it's tough to compare them directly, right? Different people, different methods.
Absolutely. It's like comparing apples and oranges, and maybe a pear and a banana too. Very different pieces of evidence. However, the review's conclusion, looking at them all together, is that they collectively point towards a potential correlation between ketamine use and sexual dysfunction. This potential link seems to have both physical elements, ED, pain, and possibly these cognitive or neurological aspects related to brain activation and pleasure.
And that signal about duration from the male studies, that really seems like a consistent thread running through those particular findings, even if we don't know the exact mechanism.
It does stand out. Again, correlation, not causation, proven here.
Uh-huh.
But seeing longer duration linked to higher ED rates in two different studies of male users is definitely a signal that warrants attention.
No, this is really important. We need to bring this back to you, the listener. You might be considering medical ketamine, maybe for depression. We have to stress again that most studies in this review looked at illicit ketamine use, often high doses, long-term use, maybe other drugs involved, uncontrolled settings. It's a very different picture from clinical treatment.
Exactly. That context is critical. Medical ketamine for depression usually involves much lower doses, given in a clinic, often in a limited series of treatments, maybe with occasional boosters later. It's not the same pattern of use at all.
So while this review flags a potential link based on studies of mostly heavy non-medical users,
It also really underscores, maybe even more importantly for our listeners, the huge gap in research. We just don't have much data specifically looking at sexual side effects in people receiving medical ketamine treatment. As medical use grows, we absolutely need studies focusing on that population using clinical doses and schedules. The studies reviewed give us hints from a different world, but they aren't the final word for clinical patients.
Okay, so let's quickly wrap up the main takeaways from this deep dive into the systematic review. The limited research available, mostly from non-medical user groups, suggests a potential link between ketamine use and sexual dysfunction. For men, this showed up as ED, possibly linked to duration of use. For women, it seemed tied to overall function, maybe related to pain in those with KC. And there's a hint of a brain-based component, too.
Mhm. And reiterating again, these findings are mostly from studies of illicit, often heavy, long-term use. The review strongly highlights the need for more research, specifically in medical populations receiving treatment for conditions like depression.
So for you listening, if you're considering or undergoing ketamine treatment, this is information to be aware of. But it's complex. The research is limited, especially research that directly applies to the clinical setting. The context of use seems really important.
And it does raise that interesting question, doesn't it? If duration seems potentially linked to risk in those illicit use studies, what does that mean for the much shorter treatment courses typically used for depression? Is the risk lower? Is it absent? We don't really have the data yet. It's definitely something to keep in mind and potentially discuss with your doctor if you have concerns.
Leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. What specific studies do we need now, focusing on patients getting medical ketamine, looking at typical doses and durations, to truly understand if there's a link to sexual health in that context? And if so, how significant it might be? Something for researchers and us to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.